There's this idea that it's somehow less than authentic as a teacher if you are not grounding your lessons every day in the problems of the world. There's climate change, democracy's hanging by a thread, pick your cause, etc. We need to get kids engaged on these topics. Well, no, you don't necessarily need to do that, especially not very, very young children. We haven't talked about SEL. What I do view it as is somewhat of an not, I don't want to say unnecessary, but inappropriate intrusion into the school day. Where is it written that the school has to be the service provider of first and last resort? When I was teaching fifth grade in the South Bronx, it was the lowest performing school in New York City's lowest performing district. Fewer than 1 out of 5 kids reading and doing math on grade level. And there was a colleague of mine who I heard her say on more than one occasion, well, look, reading and math are important, but I teach the whole child. She was saying, in my estimation, look, I know I'm not a very good teacher. I know I'm not really that good at teaching reading and math, but I'm empathetic. So why would you ask an institution that is struggling to do its rock bottom basic job to do more? And when you do that, aren't you creating a permission structure for it to fail at that core function and perhaps not be effective at the thing that you're trying to fix?
Hello, moms, dads, and grands. Welcome back to M4L Academy. If you're new here, we like to say that you can think of us as the school for parents, grandparents, and friends who want to preserve and defend liberty with a special focus on topics that impact kids, schools, and parental rights. As it is Mental Health Awareness Month, we continue the conversation today by looking at what our kids are actually learning in schools and if perhaps the doom and gloom in the classroom could be contributing to the stress and worry that so many kids are facing and feeling. The teen years, as we know, are already tough enough simply for the biological and physiological changes that are happening. And then when kids are saturated with information that really overall carries a negative tone, in conjunction with emotional deep dives and therapy light in schools, thanks to SEL's push to make everything about your feelings, well, it's suddenly not so surprising that we see the crisis in mental health that we do in kids today. To help us work through all of this and hopefully come to a hopeful conclusion, we're joined by Robert Pondiscio, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Robert had a distinguished career in media before making the leap into education in a total career change, and now he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, school choice, and charter schooling. Welcome to the program, Robert.
Thanks, Missy. Thanks for having me. I'm not sure my career in the media was distinguished, but it was long.
Well, I think it was pretty distinguished from what I read, so it seems pretty good to me. But I'm excited to talk to you about your topic here, because what really brought it in was your articles, several pieces that you've written about the doom and gloom in particular. And we're thinking that this is just not something that's really being addressed at all. Not really. So why don't you start off with, why did you think that this topic, first of all, how did this even come to your mind? Why did you think of it? And why do you feel like it's important now to start raising awareness?
Sure, thanks. Well, I occupy a somewhat odd space in this work. I was a classroom teacher for 5 years. I taught fifth grade in the South Bronx at PS 277. And that was, as I alluded to a moment ago, a mid-career public service stint. There's a program in New York City called the New York City Teaching Fellows, and it signs up mid-career professionals to spend 2 years teaching in hard-to-staff schools. So this was not supposed to be my career. This was going to be a 2-year, do-gooder mid-career public service stint, and then I'd go, back to the media business or some such. And while I was doing that work, I started to really take an interest in curriculum. The ed reform movement. It was the era of No Child Left Behind, for example, and everything was about testing and I got very, very interested, as I like to say, in what do the kids do all day? What are they learning? And for reasons I probably shouldn't bore you with, I got particularly interested in literacy. fell in love with the work of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr., who some of our listeners might recognize from Core Knowledge fame. And curriculum just became kind of the thing that I do. And I give that as background because when I went into the education policy world to continue this work after being a classroom teacher, I remember being kind of surprised that nobody was talking about what the kids do all day. It was all about testing and standards and teacher quality and I was the weirdo who would say, hey, can we talk about curriculum? Because nobody seemed to want to. So this is a long way of saying I've spent most of my post classroom career really trying to get policymakers and parents interested in that question of what do the kids do all day? What is the curriculum? How are they learning how to read? What is the math program? On and on. And there's so much work to be done, Missy, because we are so frankly incurious about it. Again, I'm not going to ride this hobby horse too much. But what I found when I left the classroom was, we just assume that what kids do all day is all the same, right? That all we need to do is measure what goes in and measure what comes out. And there was just not an appreciation for the very different experiences students could have based on curriculum. So that's a windy answer of saying, how did I get interested in this? Because that's what I'm interested in is curriculum. And once you start to kind of look under the hood, sometimes you see really good things. I'm a big fan of classical education, for example. And what got me really interested in curriculum was if any parents have listened to the Emily Hanford podcast, Sold a Story, which has really changed the way that kids are taught reading in many or most schools in this country. Well, all of the bad curriculum and pedagogy that she, unpacked in those podcasts is exactly the things that we were doing with our students 20 years ago, 25 years ago in my South Bronx elementary school. I remember to this day when those podcasts first came out, getting calls or texts or emails from some of my former grad students when I was an adjunct professor saying, "Oh my goodness, this is that stuff you were talking about in class, 20 years ago." It's like, yeah. So that also tells you how long it takes to, get change about what we do. Anyway, I'm nattering on, but you take the point, which is that, and I guess the takeaway for parents is you need to be really, really savvy about what it is that your kids are learning all day. What is the curriculum? What are the books? What is the pedagogy, et cetera? And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like part of it is that parents genuinely just don't know. They genuinely do not realize, like you said, they just kind of think that it's okay. And I know that is truly one of my biggest faults was I just sort of applied my experience in school to my children and thought, I learned that stuff just fine. Why wouldn't they be learning it? But when you look into like some of your writings have looked at examples of a day in the life of a student and these subjects, including things like a novel about self-harm and worse and then journaling about how trauma shapes identity, which just seems like the most bizarre concept of ever to have a kid write about. And then, of course, we've seen such a focus on racism overall in the country as well. So this is kind of something that's saturated in society anyway, in the news and on social media. So then when kids are also getting it drilled into them in school, it just seems like so much.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that was in the curriculum. So
Yeah.
what do these examples reveal about the overall tone that students are just immersed in overall?
Yeah, well, let me peel it back a little bit first. You were making a point, Missy, about curriculum. Something I always point out is ask any mom or dad. If you go to the pediatrician's office and they give you a prescription for so whatever's ailing your child, I'm guessing that before you leave the parking lot, you've taken out your phone, you've gone on WebMD, you've looked at the medicine, you look at the side effects. Ask the same parent, hey, what's the ELA curriculum in your child's school? What's the math textbook? They don't know because they assume it's all the same. So to your very good point, step one is being curious about it. And I always counsel like the best archaeological dig you can do is into your child's knapsack when they come home at the end of the day to look at, again, not just because we can talk about the curriculum, but it's really about the assignments and the work and the reading and the books. What is it that the kids are being asked to do all day? Um, but look, it's really hard to kind of know where to start here. Again, reflecting on when I was fifth grade teacher in the South Bronx, one of the ways that we taught writing is through the personal essay, and with the idea that, oh, kids, if you wanted them to be good writers, they should write about what they know. And as teachers, of course, we would encourage them to unburden their 10-year-old souls talking about their trauma because that was authentic. Um, and it's also inappropriate, frankly. Uh, it's it's I get the impulse, right? In other words, there's a surface plausibility to it. If kids are writing about their own experience, then they're going to be more engaged. Maybe they are, but I mean, kids are also engaged by the wonders of the world. They're engaged by dinosaurs and volcanoes and birds and history. That we needn't have them constantly looking inward. But I mean, I guess the best overall summary I can give, and I don't want to overstate the case, 'cause I can't point to data on this and say that this is universal, but it's not hard to spot it. There's this idea that it's somehow less than authentic, as a teacher, if you are not grounding your lessons every day in the problems of the world. In other words, hey kids, there's all these issues out there. There's climate change, democracy's hanging by a thread. Pick your cause, etc. We need to get kids engaged on these topics. Well, no, you don't necessarily need to do that, especially not very, very young children. But I do think, Missy, that there's this idea that we're not being serious or professional unless we are presenting a warts and all view of the world to children. And I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to pretend that this is every single teacher in every single school. But I think that this has been a dominant view of pedagogy and curriculum and not just recently, by the way. This goes back, 20 or 30 years. I've described in print how when I was getting my own master's degree in elementary education, now nearly 25 years ago, that this was present then. Where I was encouraged to teach for social justice and to be an agent of change, and all of these, these bromides that we think are new, but they're not new. They've been around for a very, very long time. And it should go without saying that if that's how you introduce these ideas to teachers, well, then they're going to bring them to work in the classroom. And to be clear, not all of it is ill-intended. Some of it it's intended to be empathetic. But as I've joked elsewhere, there's a lot of stuff going on in schools that I would describe as wrong for all the right reasons. And I'm not sure we're doing kids any favors by presenting this kind of unremittingly bleak view of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the emotions are certainly a way to get reaction, right? Like you might think of and getting more engagement, which I actually want to pause real quick and unpack that a bit because you talk about that a lot, the idea of how we get caught just, I guess, I don't know if it's in society or in the academic world, more on the idea of engagement versus learning. And so what do you mean by that? And why are so many of us falling for this concept of engagement when students, that doesn't mean maybe what we think it means? Or maybe it's not as beneficial
Yeah,
as learning?
answer is, I think that we just sell ourselves short as teachers. We assume that the world is not interesting enough as it is, that we must, that a child's educational experience has to reflect their own personal experience. Otherwise, how could we possibly, get them interested? Well, the world is pretty darn interesting. So it's our job as teachers to make it interesting, and kids are naturally curious. So I don't know that there's a crisis of engagement, as it were, but I think we assume that there is. Um, the other, and let me transfer or transition from elementary school to high school. Another experience I had in the classroom for a time. I was a civics teacher at a charter high school in New York City, where we taught what we could call loosely action civics. And if you've ever heard of this is this idea that, okay, we're not going to teach kids, how a bill becomes law, the three branches of government, etc. That it's more important to present students with the actual problems of the world and engage them. There's that word again. Challenge them to solve them. So, in other words, so the high school seniors I would teach, they would pick a passion project, an issue they were terribly concerned about, and they would spend time trying to figure out solutions to it. The critique of action civics, and I think it's valid in the most part, is that it's not really civic education. It's kind of training for activism. That has to be unpacked as well. In other words, I myself and others didn't necessarily encourage kids to become activists, but it becomes almost inevitable. In other words, if you're not concerned in civics with teaching kids how the bill becomes law, the three branches of government, where the levers are and how to pull them, so to speak, then, as I like to say, all you're preparing them to do is march in someone else's army. Their knowledge base is really, really thin, so they don't have what it takes. The theory behind action civics is, we're not going to teach civics, we're going to do civics. So we're going to empower kids. That's the other word you hear along with engagement. We're going to empower kids to be agents of change. Well, if they don't know, the nuts and bolts of the process, well, then all they're prepared to do, frankly, is march in the streets with their fists in the air. They're not prepared to talk to policymakers. They're not prepared to craft bills. They're not prepared to do the hard work that civic engagement and democracy really entails, which is getting things done in the real world, not just protesting. So, again, this is another one of those wrong for all the right reason things. The idea that we want kids to be civically engaged and take advantage of opportunities to become full citizens. That sounds great on paper, but it just doesn't work in practice the way people think it does.
Yeah, I think that actually, so that touches a little bit on the idea that you've talked about elsewhere of knowledge-rich curriculum that's really teaching them the knowledge of how you can really make a difference and beyond just going to march in someone else's army, as you said, which sounds good, and it's going to probably get clicks right away. So engagement, right? That'll be engagement because that's how we measure it. But it's not going to actually be that helpful in the long run. So
yeah, I've described one kid's process or project who I mentored to give you a kind of an extreme example of how these things sort of leave the rails. So this one young man's passion project was he wanted to work on police reform in New York City, and
wow.
his project was he led a protest at the local precinct, and the kids did a die-in where they laid down in front of the precinct, and it was, got news coverage. And then I was challenging him to turn this into a policy paper because that's what I do, right? I'm a policy guy. It's like, okay, you've come up with some really good suggestions, like you shouldn't let rookie cops, ride by themselves, etc. How are you going to let's get these ideas in front of somebody who's in a position to act on them? Okay, so who should that be? Is it? And I literally asked him, Missy, is this for the federal government? Is it for the state, or is it for the city? And he didn't know. And even though his reform is for the NYPD, he couldn't connect the dots and say, oh, it must
Wow.
be New York City. So, I mean, and that's perhaps an extreme example, but this is my point about marching in someone else's army. So good ideas, earnest young man, wanted to, cared deeply about his community, wanted to do police reform, but didn't even know who he should be talking to. That's kind of
Wow.
sad.
That is really that touches on another problem that I think we're seeing with kids not being able to think critically, but that's like tied to a whole much bigger issue. But okay, so I'll move us back to the idea of mental health and the doom and gloom in the classroom. But do you feel like, so with what you have seen in talking about the curriculum again, do you think that environment is, when kids are immersed in it all day long, is possibly contributing to some of these negative outcomes that we're seeing?
Yeah, it would probably be inappropriate for me to say. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I'd be out of my depth. But as a teacher and a parent, you tend to think, how could it not? In other words, if all your child is viewing is doom and gloom all day, then at some point that must be, that pushes them into despair, or at least runs the risk of it. We haven't talked about SEL. I'm not social and emotional learning. I'm not one of those who views this as like a Trojan horse or some such. But what I do view it as is somewhat of an I don't want to say unnecessary, but inappropriate intrusion into the school day. I'll tell you another, quick war story from my time in the classroom. So when I was teaching fifth grade in the South Bronx, just to paint the picture for you, it was the lowest performing school in New York City's lowest performing district. I mean, fewer than 1 out of 5 kids reading and doing math on grade level. And there was a colleague of mine who I heard her say on more than one occasion, "Well, look, reading and math are important, but I teach the whole child." Before we talked about SEL, we talked about things like teaching the whole child. This stuff never goes away, Missy. It just changes its names. So back then, it was teaching the whole child. If you think about that statement, what was she saying? She was saying, in my estimation, look, I know I'm not a very good teacher. I know I'm not really that good at teaching reading and math, but I'm empathetic. I care about kids. I'm a good role model. I don't want to diminish that. That's important. I want my child to be in front of somebody who cares about her. But it's not enough, right? In other words, what she was giving herself was permission to not only not feel like she's a bad teacher, but to go home feeling good about herself. So this is what I worry about with SEL. It's a permission structure to do something other than be good at what our core function is. And what is our core function? Reading, math, history, citizenship. It's not therapy. And I do worry sometimes that it's one thing if your child's teacher is a poor reading or math teacher. It's another thing altogether if they're a poor therapist. So, we need to think very, very carefully about whether we want. This is, I think, my main critique of SEL. It's not some of the concerns about a Trojan horse for Marxism or whatnot. It's like this just may not be what we want schools to be doing. And as soon as I say that, Missy, I want to be careful. I don't want to pretend that the mental health crisis in our schools is not a real and pressing concern. It is. But where is it written that the school has to be the service provider of first and last resort? In other words, we need to think very, very seriously about this from a couple of dimensions. One, is it mission creep? Is it asking schools to do something that they're not necessarily? I mean, I get it. Yeah, why do you put it in the schools? Because that's where the kids are. But typically, and I think back again on the school where I taught for many years in the South Bronx. Typically, it's the lowest performing institution in a given community. So why would you ask an institution that is struggling to do its rock bottom basic job to do more? And when you do that, aren't you creating a permission structure for it to fail at that core function and perhaps not be effective at the thing that you're trying to fix? So I don't want to diminish the idea that there's, that we need to take seriously the mental health crisis, but we need to take seriously the idea that we might be asking the wrong people to solve it.
I appreciate that perspective because I know you've said elsewhere that we keep putting everything on teachers, that
Right.
asking them to solve all the problems, which I will frankly say, prior to working with Moms for Liberty, I really don't know that I necessarily felt that. I understand where that perspective comes from, but I just worked in the corporate world. So to me, it wasn't like, not asking you to do my job. I'm not asking you to do all the, solve all the problems that the rest of the world is solving. But I see where that feeling comes from when I have now come to understand all of the expectations that have changed in school from the time that I was going to school. And that is a big difference. There's a lot happening there. And I think that no matter what anyone's feelings are about the likelihood of a Trojan horse or not, ultimately you hit it, I think, on the head, that SEL asking teachers to be therapists, basically, instead of when they can't even get the core work done of helping children to achieve the academic success that they need just to be able to really have a fighting chance in the world, honestly, that that is that's really unfair on the teachers. It's unfair on the students. It's just not. I think that's a really great point, and something that hopefully people all across all the aisles could get behind, frankly.
Yeah, this is not the question you're asking, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. I think one of the great mistakes we've made, many of us, right and left, over the years, is demonizing teachers. And look, I'm not suggesting that they're all, saints and superstars, but neither are they all demons and devils either. We have really created, we've made it an almost impossible job for ordinary people to do well, and then we blame them when it goes poorly. So I think we owe teachers a fair amount of sympathy, And we need to start to really very, very closely think about what exactly is it we're asking them to do, and how do we create the conditions for them to be successful at it.
That I actually would love to know. That's one of the things that you talk about, that I would love to unpack a bit more of how can we make it successful, help our teachers be successful in what they're doing? Because I will say, you are famously talk about this in your experience. Every time I've heard your story, is that you weren't handed a curriculum, and I think that probably most parents. I know I would have thought that you would be given a curriculum of as a
You and me
teacher.
both.
Yeah, that was really took me by surprise. So,
Yeah,
if you
me
don't have a
too.
curriculum and your teaching is I how do we do that? How do we set teachers up for success?
Yeah, no, well, I don't want to wonk out on you and talk about curriculum all day, but I will if you if you insist. I have told the story about in one of my first days in the classroom when I asked in my because again, just to paint the picture, I was almost 40 years old when I taught my first fifth grade class. I had not been in an elementary school since I'd been an elementary school student, but I quickly realized this does not look like what I remember Beverly Hill Elementary on Long Island being like. So in one of my first days, I asked my staff developer in my naivete, "Hey, where's my curriculum? What am I supposed to be teaching?" My classroom was sloppy with people who wanted to tell me how to teach, but nobody would tell me what to teach. So the staff developer, in her most unctuous voice, said, "Well, Mr. Pondiscio, you're the best person to know what every child needs." And I thought she was making fun of me. I thought because I'd come from the media world and the corporate world, like, okay, here's this, middle-aged white guy who's going to come in and save the children. Okay, Pondiscio, here you go. Here's your ship. Start bailing. But no, she meant it earnestly. And this gets back to that issue that we talked about a moment ago, Missy, about engagement. If I'm going to teach kids, it's my job to figure out what interests them. If you're going to teach them reading, well, what do they want to read about? You want to teach them writing? Well, what do they want to write about? That's what she meant. So that's where that comes from. But if you think about the impossible burden that places on teachers, so now I've got, a room full of, 25 to 30 strangers, other people's children, who I have no idea what their interests are. I'm going to make assumptions and probably make assumptions badly about that, as opposed to, what you and I might remember. Okay, in fifth grade, hey, this is the year where we learn the water cycle and photosynthesis and study ancient Egypt and Rome and read Bridge to Terabithia and get excited about these ideas. Instead, it was all bespoke. We're all supposed to like figure out what interests the kids and then tailor the lessons on any given day to those things. So what do we do as a teacher? You spend 20 or 30 or 40 hours a week on Google and Pinterest and sites like Teachers Pay Teachers and Share My Lessons, trying to create lessons from scratch. And that takes time away from getting to know kids. It takes time away from looking at their work. It takes time away from meeting their parents and talking about what's going well and what's not, what's going poorly. So the drum I've been banging on as a result ever since is we have to stop doing this to teachers. We have to give them a curriculum. Because if I have a curriculum, if I know what I'm teaching, now I can become the expert in that subject. Now I can figure out how to get kids interested in the topics that they need to know. And also, there's great evidence to suggest that, reading is not a skill. It's not like throwing a ball or riding a bike. In order to be a good reader, you have to know a little bit and sometimes a lot about the topic you're reading about. So that suggests, and this is not me talking, this is hard evidence from cognitive science. So the idea that you're going to turn kids into great readers and writers by always having them read and write about the things they know and enjoy, well, that'd be like you and I going to the gym and just working out our arms because we hate leg day. We're not going to look like Popeye, with gigantic arms. It just doesn't work. You've got to give kids a well-rounded education if you want them to be, broadly literate. And that's the thing that goes missing as well. So not only is this well-intentioned nonsense, it's also ineffective.
That is, I think that's really fascinating because I would say, as a parent, again, a parent perspective, I honestly struggle with finding it with the thought that a teacher wouldn't be given a curriculum. Like, that is just genuinely shocking to me. So I think that's really important that
Let
parents
me just so
know
you
that.
don't think that this is me making this up. We have data on this. The
Yeah.
RAND Corporation does annual surveys of teachers, and I'm not making this up, Missy. I think literally 98% of teachers in this country, elementary and middle school, say that they use at least some lessons that they either create, curate, or customize on their own. So yes, even when teachers are given a curriculum, the norm in American education is it's kind of like being given a box of parts.
Yeah.
But it's not the Bible. It is not, it doesn't come down on stone tablets. And then, I mean, I say this all the time. People have this idea that once I know the curriculum, I know what the student experience is, and it's just not true. We treat curriculum in this country the way a mechanic treats a junkyard. We scrap it for parts.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I think that something that I'm hearing is another concept that you've touched on. I hear it in between the lines, and then it's the concept of like, who is that teacher? Where is this student coming from? Which circles back to the idea of primal beliefs. And I had never actually heard of this term prior to reading
Yeah.
your writing on it. But I find it fascinating. I also I sort of feel like this is a common sense sort of thing. I guess maybe I just didn't know the terms for it, but it does really make sense. So if we don't have a curriculum or a direction that the teachers are given, the content itself, then really, and again, the idea of trying to get kids to see themselves in the work and all, write about what you're experiencing, all of those things, then that all ties into who they are and how they see the world. So can you talk a little bit about primal beliefs, what they are, and are we maybe shaping them in a bad way with the way that we're doing things?
Yeah, you alluded to primal beliefs, which was unknown to me as well, I must confess. So a few years ago, I wrote a cover story for Commentary magazine about this, and it was about what I termed the bad and the broken in the curriculum, and it unpacked many of the things we're talking about. Why it is that we seem to think it's a good idea to immerse kids in trauma narratives, in just a parade of horribles in the curriculum. And in doing the research for that piece, I stumbled across a body of work by a psychiatrist, a psychology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, a fascinating young man by the name of Jer Clifton, who studies what he calls primal beliefs. And I want to be completely clear in even introducing this. This is his work; it's not mine. But what stunned me is that it was completely unknown in the world of K-12 education, where in K-12 education, you hear a lot of conversation about, trauma informed. That's the phrase we use: trauma informed pedagogy, trauma informed curriculum. This idea that children who suffer, one or more so-called what they call adverse childhood experiences is a trauma victim, and we must handle them, delicately as a result. And it maybe that's completely wrong. Because one, it doesn't take any account of the support structures and resiliencies that kids have. In other words, do they have a strong family? Do they have a church relationship? Do they have an extended community to bolster them? But Clifton's work is fascinating to me. He studies again what's called primal beliefs, and you can go on the website and you can learn your own. And I'm going to try to simplify a very complicated body of work economically. There's this idea that most of us in education have, that your experience shapes your worldview. In other words, if I have been traumatized as a kid, well, that's going to give me this bad and broken view of the world. His and primal beliefs, by the way, I'm bearing the lead here a little bit. They are things like: is the world good or bad? Are people, friendly or dangerous? Is the world intriguing or mechanistic, or is it alive or mechanistic? And his work suggests that how you answer those questions, your primal beliefs, is how you filter your experience, not the other way around. Your experience doesn't shape your beliefs. Your beliefs shape how you interpret those experiences. And if that's true, then indulging in all of this bad and broken and quasi-therapeutic stuff that we do in schools may literally be making it worse. So I've made it my mission in recent years to kind of introduce Clifton's work to K-12 education, Not because I think it's it's the be all and end all, but I just think it presents a perspective on how we view things like curriculum and instruction and trauma informed pedagogy that should challenge our assumptions about it. So I'm kind of it's an emerging body of work. It's his, not mine, but it feels to me like this is something that not just teachers but parents should know about. In fact, he's not done that much work in K-12 education, but he did write a paper, as I recall, that made the point that parents think they're doing their child a good service if they teach them that the world is dangerous. Like this is something that we do as parents. Well, that may be a bad idea as well.
Hmm.
So in other words, we're sitting here today talking about, hey, is it a good idea or a bad idea to immerse kids in a belief that the world is bad and broken in school? Well, let's not let parents off the hook here either, Missy, because some of us do this at home as well. We think that we are protecting our children from the dangers of the world by presenting them to this idea that it's hostile and dangerous and we have to be careful. Well, we may be guilty of the same thing that we're accusing teachers of.
So that's really interesting because I feel like as parents, then, I mean, you mentioned this already, but I hear it too that it's that concept of approaching a kid with that trauma informed concept, right? And I just, I get like the goosebumps when I hear about that because it just makes me so annoyed to think of that we're treating everyone as if they're traumatized for anything. I hate even using the word at this point because it just feels so overused
Yeah.
for everything. And but that's an interesting point that you're making because I can see some parents absolutely. I mean, I joke with other parents of young kids now because my youngest is already graduated out of high school. So, and my oldest is about to graduate college. So I'm not dealing with the little kids anymore. And I see all the things that are the kid safety devices and just different things for kids, even just simple ways to have snacks in a cup that has like a reach through lid. And so instead
Yeah.
of having it in a bowl that they tip over and then their snacks fall over the floor, now it's all protected. It's like everything is protected now.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm kind of curious, are we is there any benefit to this concept of trauma informed? Why are we teaching that at all? Why did that even come about? I don't feel like that would be a positive thing for teachers to be focusing on. And I guess where's that balance point?
Well, we're not going to find a balance point unless we look for one, right? In other words, when I think, and again, I don't want to wonk out on you here, but a lot of the trauma informed practice is built on a body of work from 20 or 30 years ago that was done by some researchers where they catalog again what they call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And this idea got loose that if you have one or more of these, that you were a trauma victim. Now I think about my own time in the South Bronx. If some of those those traumas were race, poverty, having one or more family victim or family member incarcerated, well, there would be literally not a single child in my classroom who was not a trauma victim. Now, I'm trying to be fair here, and imagine what somebody who advocates for trauma informed pedagogy would say to me when I say what I'm about to say, which is explain to me. And I'm asking this, and I'm not expecting you to answer this question, but I want someone to explain to me who favors this vision of education. How can you tell me that every single child in front of me in a classroom is a trauma victim and then yet still expect me to hold them to high expectations, to still be the teacher they need to be? In other words, you are pushing me into this quasi therapeutic role that I may not be qualified for. So even if it's true, and I don't think it is, because some of these children, yes, it was the South Bronx. I'm not blithe about issues of race and poverty. Far from it. I've only taught in such settings. But if you're expecting me to view every child as a trauma victim and not, look at the structures in their life that give them resilience, supportive parents, faith relationships, etc., then I'm doing them a disservice. In other words, I'm seeing not the child, but I'm seeing a cartoon character in a sense. So it is, frankly, Missy, it's just never been explained to me in any way that I can repeat or internalize how that should do anything other than make me a worse teacher and hold them to low expectations. Because frankly, you'd be a monster if you didn't, right? In other words, don't tell me that every child in front of me has been traumatized and then tell me, oh, but that shouldn't change, the expectations you hold them to. You would be cold-blooded, I guess, is the nicest thing I can think to say to that. So, look, I'm not going to try to justify that approach. I don't buy into it. It doesn't feel right to me as a teacher. I don't think it's doing kids a good service. But as soon as I say that, I don't want to pretend that it's not absolutely true for some small percentage of kids who really have been traumatized. But then they probably don't need me as their teacher. They need a setting and an approach with somebody who is genuinely expert in this, who can give them the flavor of education, the services they need. But that's not going to be 3.7 million American teachers who are already struggling, as we said earlier, to do the basic job they were hired to do.
I completely agree with that right there, that we're not setting our kids up for success when we do that. We're not setting the teachers up for success because they're probably not the right person. And even if they are the right person, frankly, the classroom probably isn't the right scenario for a child to be unpacking all of these experiences and emotions, because some of true trauma, that's a very sensitive thing. So again, I agree with you. We're not in any way saying there aren't examples of that or aren't very real times that it exists, but to paint with the broad brush of every child is a trauma victim is not fair to them. And also, I think that one thing that I'm genuinely curious from an educator's perspective and having experience working in the school system and in school policy for so long, I just don't understand why we would not want to push our kids to succeed. Like why we would want teachers to just, I don't know, cushion their lives so much when in reality, everybody, I mean, you can't tell me that a teacher doesn't look at like a player in the NFL and not think it took a lot of hard work to get there. And there were going to be some painful days and some days that person wanted to quit, but they stuck to it and they made it through and pushed through and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Just that basic concept, we're robbing children of a potential by not giving them high expectations and not allowing them to rise to them. And
Yeah.
why is that being pushed? I just don't. Why are teachers buying it?
Um,
For the ones that are,
that's
recognizing that not all of them are.
I think it's fairly common. I think I alluded to earlier. There's a great impulse in education to kind of look for shortcuts and the easy button. Well, actually, now that you get me to reflect on it, if you think about it, who are teachers? By and large, teachers are those who enjoyed school. They were good at it. They had fun. They were successful. They want to share what they know. So I was a B student on my best days. So I'm probably a lot more typical of the students that we're trying to reach and teach in American schools than those straight A students who, for whom it came easy. So I mean, I don't want to be glib here, but I assume that's a large measure of it. In other words, this is fun, this is easy, so I want to make it fun and easy for you, because school should be fun and easy. Well, it's not. Okay, learning is work. I love your comparison to the NFL because you're right. It's so funny. We education professionals tend to look down their noses at coaches. Like, oh, they're not real teachers. Well, some of the best teachers I've ever met have been coaches for exactly the reasons that you just described, because they tell you that it is hard and they make you work. And if you don't perform, you sit. Okay, these are hard lessons to learn, but they're valuable lessons to learn. Okay, I use my own daughter as an example. My daughter had the benefit of very good schools in New York City, elite schools even, where frankly nobody ever told her, that she wasn't good enough. But she was also a competitive athlete. So she played volleyball at a high level for 7 years, and she was an unusually tall little girl. So she was a starter for most of the first couple of years, and then suddenly the rest of the kids got to be tall and accomplished, and suddenly she had to really fight for her position on the roster. To this, and when I think back, and frankly, my wife hates when I say this out loud in public. I think of the money we spent on her school, and I think, like, what really had the formative experience on her? Was it her education or her involvement in sports? It was sports, and it's not even close. This young lady has I'm bragging on my daughter. She has a work ethic that would reduce me to tears, and she did not get that from her elite schools. She got it by learning the lessons of the volleyball court.
That is those lessons, and I think you can learn them in schools. I think you can learn it in academics, but when we don't hold our kids to high standards, that just makes me sad because I was a good student. I loved school. I love learning. I absolutely love learning. I'm very curious and love to learn about all the things. And it just makes me sad that kids don't
Okay,
when
can
kids
I
do.
add something here, Missy? Which is, and
Sure.
this is a policy thing. I'm going to take off my teacher hat and put on my education policy hat, and again, sound a note of sympathy for teachers. So when I'm older than you, but when I was a kid, no, there's no way if I brought home a bad report card that my parents would ever think to hold my teachers accountable. They would hold me accountable. Why did you fail that test? You need to study harder. Now look at the world of education policy, where for years we did not hold teachers accountable. Now we do, right? And that's a good thing. I'm not anti-accountability. I've got a complicated relationship with testing, but in the main, I think it's been more good than bad. Now we have an education policy approach where if a kid fails, well, that means the teacher failed. Okay, so follow that idea where it leads. If every student's outcome is my responsibility as the teacher, that none of it is on the student or accounting for mom and dad, well, then what incentive do I have as a teacher to do anything other than lower expectations? Because my job performance is being judged on how those kids do. I make use this example all the time of high school graduation reports or high school graduation rates, which are at historic levels, and they're also nonsense. Okay, because if you look at things like SAT scores and NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, they haven't budged. It looks like a dead man's EKG, but somehow graduation rates are going higher. Well, those two things can't possibly both be true. If graduation rates are higher, that means more and more students are rising to the level of accomplishment that they need to graduate. But the empirical testing data that we have says it's not so. So what does that mean? It means we're just declaring them high school graduates. Doesn't matter you didn't come to school half the time. Didn't matter that you failed your classes. Oh, here, do some credit recovery, and we're going to hand you a diploma. So every incentive in education right now is to just move kids up and out, and then pat ourselves on the back for what a good job we did. And I'm not saying that's entirely that the teachers are victims here. However, the policy levers that we put in place demand that, because if you don't pass the kid, if the kid doesn't graduate, well, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. So there's just no incentive anywhere in the system to be honest with kids and to be honest with parents and to tell the truth about their academic performance.
Well, I can say that you and I have actually exactly that in common as far as if I brought a bad grade home, then my parents absolutely would have said, "This is on you. Why didn't you study?" Or if I was notorious for waiting until the night before a paper was due to have my parents like review it and even write it. Frankly, I would not usually even start. Anyway, so shame on me. But I have gotten much better at those things. Nevertheless, though, you bring up a really interesting point. So I think that first of all, absolutely 100%, we need to be holding our kids accountable. I think that squarely lies on parents. Parents not wanting to be too much of the friend, not willing to have that difficult conversation with their kids, not willing to be the bad guy, if you will, and potentially even get into a fight or have consequences because your child's not doing what they as well as they could be doing. But you talk about the idea of no incentive in policy. So as a parent, what does that look like? What from the education policy perspective, what could we be doing different to encourage actual changes?
Okay, I'm going to make a guess based on what I know of Moms for Liberty, that there's probably a lot of opt-out sentiment among mom. Is that true? Like
Yep.
opting out of standardized tests? Okay, let me offer a different alternative. I don't love tests. I don't hate
Well,
tests. What
I
I
should say it may be more opt out of specific subjects or the types of
Okay,
curriculum, like things that are being taught because it doesn't necessarily agree with ideologies. As
fine.
far as tests, I'm not sure. That's
Okay.
interesting.
Here, I live in New York, and New York has been historically a bit of a hotbed of the
Okay.
so-called opt-out movement, where parents just, they don't allow their kids to sit for standardized tests. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I have a different view of it. In other words, I'm not anti-testing, I'm anti-testing culture. And what I mean by that is once you tell teachers and schools that the only thing that matters is the reading and math test, it shouldn't surprise us that the only thing that gets taught is reading and math. I'm
Hmm.
a E.D. Hirsch core knowledge guy. I know how you raise reading scores. You don't do it by focusing on reading and math. You get it by teaching kids science and history and art and music and that whole range of fascinating stuff. That's where reading comprehension comes from. We could talk about that at length another time. But when you create a permission structure that encourages teachers and schools to only focus on reading and math and nothing else, well, then you're doing damage to kids. So here's my proposition for you, Missy. I would love to see some group of parents take me up on this. Instead of saying we're going to opt out of tests, I want them to march into the principal's office or the district superintendent's office first day of school in September and say, okay, Soup, we're going to make a deal. We'll come for the tests and we'll sit down. But the first minute you take out those test prep books, the first minute you give a practice test, the first minute you turn my child's education soup to nuts into test prep, don't bother because we're staying home. We want our children to have, yes, reading and math, but we want them to have that full, rich curriculum, that full, rich experience. We want them to have all the science, all the history, the geography, the field trips, the art, the band, the orchestra. That's what education should look like. You do that, the kids are going to come to school on testing day. And oh, by the way, they're probably going to do better on the test than they would if you did all this test prep stuff. So that's my parent platform, as it were, is don't just opt out of the test, don't just protest the test, use your power, okay? Because you do have power as a parent to influence what kids do. The schools want the test results. You want the full, rich education. Have a meeting of the minds on day one to say, we don't want our child's education to turn into drudgery and test prep because, frankly, it doesn't work for anybody. It's boring for kids. It's mindless for teachers, and it's ineffective.
Yeah, well, it seems to be because the results have not been good since
Right?
we've been changing it. So that also, so this ties into one other thing, and this is a little bit, I don't know if it's exactly related, but I hear it all the time, and I don't know that everyone will necessarily fully understand it. Again, I'm coming from business world, so not fully immersed in all the education things, but we talk about the idea, or I hear about the idea of direct or explicit
Oh,
instruction. All
yeah.
right. And so when we're teaching kids, like, what does that look like? Why should that be why should that be encouraged versus, I guess, the alternative? And what is the alternative? Which is
Because
clearly
it works. That's why it should be encouraged, because it works. Um, Man, we could talk about this ad nauseum, but there's this idea that is dominant, I think, in pedagogy and teaching of we'll call it minimally guided instruction. And
mm,
look, it all comes from the same world of authenticity and engagement, etc. So let the child decide what they want to learn, challenge them with a question, and then let them figure it out. Sounds interesting, sounds intriguing. Hey, we all have stories about projects that we love to do as when we were in middle school or high school as kids. So why not make the kids' education like that all the time? Well, it's ineffective. It's not a good use of time. Um, it doesn't work. I have a good friend by the name of Zach Rochelle, who's a master teacher based out on the West Coast, and he wrote a book recently with this wonderful title. It's called "Just Tell Them," um, it's, it's kind of a guide to direct and explicit instruction. But I mean, I don't want to wonk out and cite research studies, but the most compelling research that we have is from 50 years ago, a study called Project Follow Through, one of the biggest research studies ever done on education. And it just showed that the most effective pedagogy, the most effective curriculum was something called direct instruction. And nothing we've seen since has come close to matching it. So, but teachers think it's boring, right? And we say, oh, it's what do you want us to do? Read from a script? Yeah, if it works for
so
kids, read from a
for parents,
script.
what would that look like for parents who maybe don't understand or maybe don't realize that direct instruction isn't happening in schools? What should it be looking like versus what might they be seeing right now?
Wow, great question and hard to summarize. What my mission in life, I suppose, is I would like, and I alluded to before, I would like parents to be kind of more savvy education consumers, the way they would be for for medicine or other aspects. So yeah, it would be worthwhile a conversation when you go for parent teacher night to ask, what's the curriculum? What's your instructional approach? Do you favor minimally guided instruction, or do how much project-based learning do you do versus how much explicit instruction do you do, and what's the difference? What do you do in this school? Because again, we have this idea that it's all the same, that every fifth grade class is pretty much like every other fifth grade class, and it's just not. Children will have a very different experience, not just from state to state and district to district, even school to school, but across the hall in the same school. Um, we haven't really touched upon this, but I think it's important. Uh, Teachers are, to a degree that I think would shock most of us, free agents. I think back on the story I told a moment ago, Missy, about where's my curriculum? Well, Mr. Pondiscio, you're the best person to know. That's the standard. The standard is the teacher, kind of figures it out, on their own. And look, there may be some teachers for whom this is a terrific way of working. For most of us who are mere mortals, it's not effective. But you cannot make assumptions. Again, even if you know the curriculum, even if you know the Board of Education has purchased, CKLA or UFLI or a different curriculum, it doesn't necessarily mean it's being taught. So parents need to learn how to ask really good, not hostile, but probing questions. What's the curriculum? What's your instructional technique? Do you do minimally guided instruction? Do you give explicit directions? There's I'm not expecting every parent to become an expert in this, but know enough to have a detailed conversation about the instructional approach in your child's classroom.
That is a really great point because it's just so important for parents to understand. And I absolutely take ownership of the fact that I took it for granted. I did not. I was a good student. I loved to learn, so I just kind of assumed that was happening in the next generation. And I worked with my kids at home, so I didn't really think over the top of it at school. I just didn't think there was a need to be concerned. So it was really eye-opening to me. But all of those pieces are just so important for parents to understand. And that's encouraging too, because those are real practical steps, that things that parents can do if they're concerned about what's happening in schools, in the curriculum, what's being taught or not taught, what things are being focused on. And so that helps for sure to give us a direction. Do you have any other takeaways or suggestions, other practical tips that if parents are feeling overwhelmed, going back to the beginning of the conversation where the topics and being taught might be negative, maybe the teachers are unfortunately taking this concept of trying to implement agents of change or create agents of change, and that alone is a heavy and not really what they should be doing, because then they don't have time to be teaching the basics that need to be getting taught anyway. So what can parents do to try to improve that in their school?
No, it's a great question. Be aware, be informed. I guess I'll put in a plug for teachers. A lot of us who are concerned and rightly concerned about what we've been talking about for the past hour. The bad and the broken, the degree to which kids are being told a negative view of the world and their country and their community, etc. Don't assume it's universal. Assume that the teachers are well intended until you have evidence that they're not. And I use this example all the time, Missy. So, not a day goes by that you can go on, libs of TikTok, and see yet another video of some teacher completely abusing their authority and their position and bragging about it, in a video, not just a gotcha video, but sometimes they're like, up front, like, bragging about just silly things that they're doing. And we what do we do when we see that as a parent? We think, oh, look at that. See, this is what's happening in our schools, meaning we universalize a negative experience. And I don't want to diminish the idea that there are some number of teachers out there who are using their positions in their classrooms performatively and taking untoward advantage of the power and authority they have over 25 impressionable young people, other people's children. That is a problem, and should have no patience for it. But we shouldn't follow that idea off a cliff either and assume that because I've even seen a lot of it, on things like libs of TikTok, that therefore we have 3.7 million teachers who are all terrible, who are all waking up in the morning trying to, indoctrinate our children or sell them a bill of goods. So assume the positive until you have evidence to the contrary. But that doesn't mean, drop your kid off in the morning and assume all will be well. You have to be aware. I alluded earlier. Go through your child's knapsack. Look at those assignments. What are they reading? Who assigned this? Yes, the starting line is, hey, what's the curriculum in my child's school? But then ask the teacher, well, how closely do you follow it? Are you marching through it day by day rigorously, or are you customizing it? And if you're customizing it, where are you pulling from? Unfortunately, I wish there was an easy answer other than diligence and paying attention, but the answer is diligence and paying attention.
Honestly, that's it. That really, I appreciate you saying that, because I think sometimes in today's world, I call it the microwave generation. Like, we expect everything to be solved in 30 seconds in the microwave, but or have a magic pill for everything, right? And it's just not. Some things just take work. And one of those things is being a good parent. And that involves, your kid or if you want your kid to get a good education and be raised the way that you want them to be raised, you do have to be very involved. You can't just drop them off at any school. It doesn't matter if it's public or private, or if you're at home and you have them online in like a cyber charter school or something like that. Like, you have to be involved as a parent, or you cannot be surprised if the outcome is not what you want it to be. And it's not the answer that probably everyone wants to hear, but I think it's reality. So I appreciate the truthfulness there. This has been an absolute. Oh, go ahead.
No, we're in violent agreement. I wish there were an easy button, but there isn't one.
Yeah, I very much. I appreciate your perspectives on all these things, because I know what I was going to say. And it's funny because I genuinely appreciate the not going off the cliff, because there can be times that it's very hard when as what I'm doing, where we're studying all of these things and these topics, that it can get very easy to feel like, oh my gosh, is there anything good in teaching at all? Are there any good teachers? And you're correct, especially with libs of TikTok. Like, it is very easy to see those videos and then apply that to all teachers and just assume all teachers are like that, which really isn't fair. And frankly, ends up doing the exact same thing that we're complaining about, as far as having negative content or such doom and gloom in the classroom, and bringing that on our kids, that we're doing the same things to ourselves. And there is good, there is positive, there really are good people out there, there really are good teachers. And I appreciate you highlighting that, because sometimes it can get lost.
Well, can I, and at the risk of calling out Moms for Liberty, who I respect and admire, sometimes advocates do kids an injustice as well. So again, I'm a curriculum guy. One of the best ELA curriculums that I know of is called Wit and Wisdom. It's a very robust, rigorous, knowledge-rich ELA curriculum that's widely adopted. Well, a couple of years ago, there was a Moms for Liberty chapter in Tennessee that, if I'm remembering correctly, tried to get that curriculum thrown out of Tennessee schools lock, stock, and barrel because of a single book, about seahorses that said that, male seahorses carry babies. And this was evidence of, the curriculum is woke and, it's got to go. So, do your homework. In other words, it's virtually impossible that you're not going to find, I challenge you to find a published curriculum anywhere that you agree 100% with every aspect of it. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's, let us be like, savvy consumers of these things, but not overreact. Because if you do throw that curriculum out, well, then you're creating a permission structure yourself for that teacher to go on Google and Pinterest and share my lesson and who knows where else. Because this is something else we haven't discussed, Missy. The permission structure that we create in education of telling every teacher you're the best person to know what every child needs means they're going to go online, every night looking for materials that they think will interest kids. And there's a lot of folks that, while I don't believe that we have 3.7 million teachers out there determined to indoctrinate kids, there are a lot of people out there who do view the classroom as an irresistible target, whether
Mhm.
to sell political ideas or just sell things. And the teacher who does not have a curriculum because we demanded that it get thrown out because it had one book that we didn't like. Well, now we're demanding that teacher go into the curriculum bazaar and pull down who knows what to put in front of kids the next day.
That actually makes it a lot harder on parents then to be able to see what their kids are being taught. That we didn't get a chance to fully unpack that, so I'm hoping I'm going to bring you back on to be able to talk a little bit about the concept, which I've heard you cover more in depth elsewhere, and I really like it. That this what you just said right there, that teachers are given this kind of free reign on whatever they would be doing, and I don't think a lot of parents realize that, because I know
Oh,
I
I'm sure
didn't
they do
realize
not.
that. So that was a
Yeah.
real eye-opening point as well. Well, real quick, tell us let everyone know where they can find where they can find you and follow you online so that they can stay up with all your work.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm a scholar, and I always want to make air quotes when I say I'm a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, because there are people there who have real credentials that I do not. So I'm happy to work under the same roof as guys like Charles Murray and Yuval Levin and people like that. But if you Google me at the American Enterprise Institute, virtually everything that I write or say, probably this podcast as well, will show up on what they call your scholar page there, so you can keep up with it there. And because it's the law, I have a Substack now, because we all have to have a Substack. So mine is called The Next 30 Years, and that title may sound weird, but it's because we spent the last 30 years trying to improve schools by changing policies. So my hope is we can spend the next 30 years trying to improve outcomes by focusing on what the kids do all day, on curriculum, on instruction. So my Substack is called The Next 30 Years.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. We've really appreciated the conversation.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Missy.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation. It feels like this is just common sense when you think about it. I know I've said that several times today, but then I'd be willing to bet, like I said, that most parents don't actually realize what's being taught in class. And to reiterate, neither of us are saying that kids should never learn about the hard parts of life: war, poverty, injustice, the coming AI dystopia or utopia that may or may not be down the pipe. These are all real things that need to be addressed, and kids do need to learn about it when it's appropriate. But this also isn't the only time in history that we've had to deal with something hard, and it certainly won't be the last. And we don't have to dwell on the hard times, and should frankly very much see the hope in our ability to overcome. If you haven't already, we encourage you to check out our full toolkit with more interviews, a smart book, handouts, articles, white papers, and more at mforlacademy.org/SEL. And as James Madison said, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. And that is the mission of M4L Academy. Class dismissed.